morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Kyle Ferrier, Director of Academic Affairs and Fellow at KEI, as well as the moderator for today's event, which is the second of two panels that we've organized at KEI under the umbrella title of Navigating Troubled Waters, the Republic of Korea and the Indo-Pacific. If you missed yesterday's panel, not to worry, you can find it on our YouTube page. I think you'll find the high-level conversation perfectly complements the narrower discussion we're about to have on advancing South Korea's regional security relationships with the United States and ASEAN members, neither of which is mutually exclusive, considering how the principles of ASEAN centrality form much of the regional architecture that the US is attempting and seeking to uphold in its own Indo-Pacific policy. As many of you know, the title of the program suggests, South Korea is faced in a position of strategic ambiguity in the region as tensions rise between China and the United States, respectively, Korea's largest economic partner and security partner. While it does not seem like these structural issues are going anywhere anytime soon, our first two speakers today will be providing practical suggestions for Seoul to still advance key relationships amid its difficult situation in the region, based on papers they've written for KEI. If you haven't seen them yet, I think they were either in your confirmation emails that you have seen if you're accessing via Zoom. But if you're watching on YouTube or you're watching the event later, you can find them on our website, keia.org. If you haven't seen, like I said, if you haven't seen them yet, that's where you can find them. Following that, we'll have some insightful comments from our discussant that will jumpstart the conversation, and then we'll start addressing questions from the audience. Before we get to all that, though, I'd like to introduce you to each of our speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll be talking. First up is Andrew Yeh, who's a professor of politics and director of Asian Studies at the Catholic University of America and a senior fellow at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. His most recent book is quite relevant to the discussion that we'll be having here today. It's entitled Asia's Regional Architecture, Alliances and Institutions in the Pacific Century, published in 2019 by Stanford University Press. He's also joining us from the Philippines, where he was recently a senior Fulbright scholar. Next up, we'll have Prashant Parameswaran. He's a fellow with the Wilson Center's Asia program, where he produces analysis on Southeast Asian political and security issues, Asian defense affairs, and US foreign policy in the Asia Pacific. He is a director at the consultancy Bauer Group Asia and a senior columnist at The Diplomat, one of Asia's leading current affairs publications. And then our discussant, Dr. Hu Chu-ping, is a senior lecturer in the Strategic Studies and International Relations program at the National University of Malaysia, or UKM. She is currently leading a Korea Foundation-funded project on Southeast Asia, North Korea relations, examining the security, economic linkages, and strategic uncertainties of North Korea's security challenges in the region. And with that, I will get us started and turn the spotlight over to Andrew.
Okay, thanks very much, Kyle. Let me just share my screen because I do have a few slides to show. And while that's going up, I just wanted to thank the staff of KEI, especially you, Kyle, for bringing us all together to talk about South Korea's regional relationships just prior to the Moon-Biden summit, which we are all anticipating. I'd also like to thank the Korea Foundation, which has supported my research on South Korean foreign policy. My remarks this morning are based on my paper just published by KEI that Kyle had mentioned that examines the US-South Korea alliance in the context of Asia's regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific. So the key points or the key puzzle here is that at the crux of the issue here is the Biden administration's desire to uphold the rules-based international order by reinforcing a network of inter-Asia alliances and multilateral institutions on one hand, and the Moon Jae-in government's relative reluctance to deepen and expand security ties linked to an Indo-Pacific strategy that counterbalances China on the other hand. There are two overarching questions I'd ask. The first is, how can the Biden administration encourage Seoul to coordinate with other like-minded countries committed to sustaining a rules-based regional order while helping South Korea mitigate potential strategic vulnerabilities? And the second question is, to what extent should South Korea actively coordinate with other regional actors in shaping the strategic environment. And I'll just give you my key point or punchline here. It's that by working in concert with other countries in the Indo-Pacific, Seoul can reduce its geopolitical vulnerability while advancing its national and regional interests. So I thought the first place to begin is to maybe give a little bit of background about Asian security architecture. And as Colin mentioned, I'd written a book on this topic in 2019. But we do need to understand the context of Asia's regional architecture, which I characterize as a complex patchwork of overlapping formal and informal institutions. And so this can include US bilateral alliances, ASEAN-related institutions, China-led regional institutions. We have a bevy of trilaterals, minilaterals that are going there. So it's a patchwork of overlapping institutions. Former Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter had referred to this as a principled and inclusive security network. Now, in terms of the geographic scope, I would say that the regional architecture, the security architecture has expanded over time. For the United States, the focus has traditionally been East Asia and really Northeast Asia, which served as a bulwark against security threats during the Cold War. But we've seen this expansion over time with East Asia or the Asia-Pacific formulation. And then in the last 4 or 5 years, we've now seen a further expansion to encompass the Indo-Pacific. So I don't know if we'll soon be hearing the term Indo-Pacific security architecture rather than Asian security architecture. But the point is we are seeing an expansion of the regional architecture. Oops. Okay, so in terms of, sorry, just jumping around my slides. So in terms of the Biden administration and their outlook on U.S.-South Korea relations, it does, with a change in administration, there has been a shift perhaps in a shift in U.S.-South Korea dynamics, or we may anticipate this shift. The Biden administration's liberal international outlook increases the relevance of the regional security architecture, and it carries a positive impact on bilateral alliances, including the U.S.-South Korea alliance. We might say that multilateralism is back, and President Biden is looking to build a coalition of like-minded countries willing to support a rules-based, open, and inclusive order. However, this puts some pressure on South Korea to stretch its capacity and capabilities beyond the Korean Peninsula and the Northeast Asia corridor. Such expectations are likely to push the Moon government past its comfort zone, especially as progressive leaders in South Korea seek to reduce their reliance on the U.S.-South Korea alliance over the long term. So if that's the United States, if that's the Biden administration. For the Moon government, what is their outlook with the Indo-Pacific and the relationship with the United States? South Korea's place in the regional architecture, I would also argue, has evolved, although not necessarily in a linear direction. So I want to say something about South Korean regional architecture before I get to the alliance piece of this. But if we go back to the late 2000s, this is under President Lee Myung-bak, we had this idea of a global Korea, and it was here when Korea's middle power identity really took force. By the early 2010s, South Korea had become an active participant and host to dozens of formal and informal regional institutions, summits, and forums. The 2009 US-South Korea Joint Vision Statement also helped recalibrate the alliance to the 21st century to look beyond the Korean Peninsula and address new threats, including non-traditional threats emerging in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, South Korea under Moon has continued to embrace its middle power identity and expand its regional foreign policy, most notably through the New Southern Policy. And this is something that I think Prashant will talk more about. But for the most part, the Moon government has turned more inward to hone in on inter-Korea relations. Of course, inter-Korea relations and North Korea issues should be prioritized as it affects South Korea more than any other foreign policy issue. but expending much of its political capital on inter-Korea relations has not been without some costs. Seoul appears at times disengaged and somewhat marginalized by others in discussions pertaining to Indo-Pacific security. The Moon government has also taken a more passive than active, rather than an active role in shaping the region's strategic environment. The Indo-Pacific narrative is one that originated from the region. It's not something that was, it's not something that the United States first came up with. It was the Australians and the Japanese. And later it was adopted by the Trump administration. But now the Indo-Pacific is, this idea of the Indo-Pacific is embraced even by countries outside of Asia, most notably within the EU. So regional cooperation around the Indo-Pacific strategy is going to move forward with or without South Korea. And if there's a key point I want to make, is that South Korea should not miss this train. The foreign policy autonomy and hedging behavior are no guarantee for regional stability, much less Korean security, given the thickening web of security ties. So you can't really have this strategy that's independent from the rest of the network. And the adoption of a more neutral position in the Indo-Pacific doesn't give any guarantee for preventing China from bullying Korea or for undercutting Seoul's regional economic interests. We still see South Korea, I don't see any reason why China wouldn't intrude into South Korea's air defense identification zone, or even in terms of fishing, the Chinese will probably continue to make incursions into South Korea's exclusive economic zone. So again, there's no guarantee that this type of hedging behavior or trying to put forward a more foreign policy autonomy will lead to a greater security for South Korea. So with that in mind, I just wanted to close with a few recommendations. I'm going to be brief here, but I'm hoping that we could spend some time in the Q&A, maybe fleshing these out a bit further. And so the first recommendation here is that Seoul should boost the peace pillar of the New Southern Policy. Now, I didn't really get into the New Southern Policy in my talk, and hopefully Prashant well, but this is South Korea's, the Moon government's turn to Southeast Asia and India. And there's three pillars to this: prosperity, peace, and people. But the peace pillar has been somewhat downplayed, so I would suggest addressing common issues, boosting this pillar and addressing common issues such as protection against illegal fishing and encroachment of EEZs, or support of freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. And doing so can strengthen South Korea's credibility as a reliable strategic partner in the region, not only for the US, but for other like-minded partners as well. The second recommendation is that Seoul and Washington can support forums and institutions that advance human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific. So this isn't something that both sides do because there's debate about values and how much should that be promoted or pushed. We already know that the Biden administration is going to look at human rights and democracy more seriously, and I think this is an area that Seoul can also be a leader in within the Asia region. It is a democracy, and I think it can do more or say more on this front and be a leader within the region in conjunction with the United States. I think some of the steps that Seoul has taken regarding the issue in Myanmar has been a welcome step forward. So we look forward to seeing Seoul the Moon government stepping up further on the issue of human rights. In terms of trilateral relations, I would argue that Washington should continue to encourage trilateral cooperation between Japan and South Korea, its two closest partners in Northeast Asia, especially when it comes to sharing of information and intelligence on North Korea's missile and nuclear program. And I think this is the one area within the first, 120 days now where we have seen a push at the working level, even at the deputy level, for the three countries to really inform one another on the North Korea policy, on different intelligence, different approaches to addressing addressing the North Korean nuclear issue. This doesn't mean that the history issues are going to be resolved overnight, but at least there is some dialogue or discussions taking place between the two countries. And finally, I would say that navigating relations between Beijing and Washington need not be seen as a choice. I often think that we tend to see South Korea as having to choose between Beijing or Washington. I know the Moon government certainly doesn't see it that way, even though that's how it's often framed. But on this point, Washington should recognize and appreciate South Korea's unique historical and geopolitical concerns that inform the Moon government's foreign policy objectives. Meanwhile, rather than hedge between the US and China, I think Seoul can also play more of a bridging role between the two great powers. I mean, Seoul does have, I think, a better relationship with Beijing than some other countries, and so an issue like North Korea, I think that's one area where I think the Moon government may try to encourage Beijing to play a more constructive role. I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing what the rest of our panelists have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Prashant.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, and it was great listening to Andrew's presentation, because I see we have a lot of overlap and intersections here. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'll keep my remarks brief. So first of all, thank you so much to Kyle and to KAI for the opportunity. What I enjoy the most about writing these papers and having these discussions is it is really an opportunity to step back and really think through these big issues amid a lot of change that is happening, and that's much appreciated, particularly in the very strange context that we find ourselves still in amidst COVID-19. So I would say, I mean, just to start, this is, so my paper focused on this sort of question that I sort of ask about a lot of Southeast Asia's relationships with external powers, which is that to what extent are these balanced in terms of the three components that we usually see ASEAN and Southeast Asia talk about these relationships? So in the ASEAN sort of parlance, it's usually economics, political security, and people-to-people ties, or social-cultural community in the three communities framework, right? So, and I think if I look and apply that to, you can apply that to various relationships. You can apply it with respect to China, where China has actually made a lot of inroads in some of the security relationships of the past few years. So the concept, to the extent that we talked about the United States having security relationships with Southeast Asia and China having economic relationships, to my mind, that concept is quite outdated. And I don't see Beijing or even Southeast Asian countries thinking that way. But if I look at South Korea by way of a contrast, you sort of see this pattern where over the past few decades, you see laments about, this is a relationship where South Korea within Southeast Asia has long been recognized as contributing a lot in terms of its contributions to the regional architecture, more so actually than the United States and some other countries. In terms of economics and technology, you actually don't have to tell Southeast Asians that South Korea is very involved. South Korea is involved in a lot of ways. South Korean companies have actually penetrated several of these Southeast Asian countries. But the one component actually that you see South Korea, to put it very crudely, underperforming with respect to the relationship is the security domain. And to my mind, when I started working on this and you chatted with individuals in Southeast Asia, policymakers in both Seoul and Southeast Asian capitals, there wasn't a whole lot of surprise that this actually was in play. If you look at the trajectory of how South Korea has evolved in terms of its relationships with Southeast Asia, the relationships began actually with the diplomatic and people-to-people components, right? So there was this diplomatic contestation between South Korea and North Korea. Initially, there was the story, which actually I thought in the first panel discussion yesterday was very aptly captured by Ashley Tellis, right? Thinking about the Indo-Pacific not as a slogan or a code word for US policy, but really sort of a layered pattern where over a period of time, this sort of regional architecture in Asia has evolved in the place where you had economic development in Northeast Asia, then spreading to Southeast Asia, and increasingly spreading to South Asia. And it's really about how various countries and institutions adapt to that reality. That's essentially what the Indo-Pacific is all about. And that dovetails a lot with what Andrew wrote in his book about historical institutionalism, right? These are a layered set of institutions that are in search of how they adjust to challenges and evolutions in the security and broader diplomatic environment. So that's essentially where we are with respect to South Korea's relationships with Southeast Asia. I also think it's a very interesting time to be talking about this topic. So one is, I know maybe KAI and Kyle, maybe it wasn't as deliberate in terms of the timing, but it's fortuitous in the sense that, so we have the Moon-Biden summit coming, as Andrew mentioned. We have the Shangri-La dialogue, which, still questions about how is it going to be held and so on and so forth amid COVID-19. But that really serves as an annual check on the pulse of the Asian security environment. And then we also have the sort of ongoing U.S.-South Korea dialogue and cooperation. So both Washington and Seoul, to my mind, are not unaware of the challenges with respect to how to advance the security aspect of the dimension. So actually on May 12th, we saw a public readout of conversations between the United States and South Korea, focusing precisely on the subject of my paper, which is how the United States and South Korea can work more on Southeast Asia and on ASEAN and regional architecture more broadly, right? So this is a conversation that is actively happening. It is great to see. I also think it is an interesting point of timing because there are some challenges as well, right? So we are talking about the Indo-Pacific in a context where there were a number of Indo-Pacific countries that were actually thinking about this concept way before the United States. Australia was thinking about it, Japan was thinking about it, and you had the Trump administration come in and adopt it, which was welcome to a certain degree in some Southeast Asian capitals where the Obama administration was read as not being, quote unquote, as tough on China as they should have been. But I also think it sort of created a sense of confusion about what the concept was about. So if the Indo-Pacific is about sort of challenging China in a very public way, it's also about protectionism and sort of rebalancing trade relationships. How do we actually think about it and what does it mean for Southeast Asian countries? And this concept which Andrew mentioned about choices is really important for Southeast Asian countries, right? As it is for Seoul and other countries in the Asia Pacific. So that is one point of conversation. We've seen the Biden administration take a number of changes, unsurprisingly, about how it approaches alliances and partnerships, how it's approaching multilateralism. But I still think in the region, when I talk to Southeast Asian friends, they're still waiting to see what the Biden administration is actually going to do. So some of the reviews that the administration has on China, on supply chains, they actually haven't said a lot. And they've tried very deliberately not to do that. And actually the big point that we're going to be looking at towards the end of the year is what the Biden administration is going to do with the next round of Asian symmetry, where there are a lot of questions about what the Biden administration is going to do economically on trade, which still have gone unanswered. How is the Biden administration going to approach ASEAN and the multilateral environment? We still don't have a sense of that. So to my mind, this is a very good time to be having this conversation. So in the remaining time I have, I'm just going to sketch out a little bit about what I found and how I formulated this paper, which, as Kyle mentioned, I'm not going to go through all the details and specifics. That's all available in the full paper. I tried to do three things in the paper. One is look at the evolution of South Korea and how it's approached Southeast Asia. Two, what are some of the opportunities and challenges in terms of the dynamics of South Korea's relationship with Southeast Asia? And three, what are some of the implications? So I'm going to sketch out the first two very quickly and then move to the implications, because I think that's probably the most interesting aspect for the conversation we're going to have. Essentially, the evolution, as I mentioned earlier, South Korea has tended to look at Southeast Asia as a product of how it's externalizing what is going on within its country. And South Korea has been, within the context of the Asia Pacific, actually quite a good example of what Asia should be, right? Economically prosperous, more democratic, and sort of actually thinking about some of the regional and global architectures and institutions, actually sometimes, as I said, more so than the United States in a much more sustained way. But on the other hand, the security component of the relationship with Southeast Asia has actually been quite understated. And that's actually what we're sort of grappling with. And that comes amid four key drivers that have actually accentuated the importance of thinking about the security domain. One is South Korea's own middle power activism. So we've seen South Korea actually engage more geopolitically globally more so than sub-regionally with Southeast Asia. So that is actually a gap which doesn't exist across all of Seoul's external relationships. The second is the rise of common security challenges. So this is not to say that this is a purely geopolitical conversation, right? So if you look at humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, South Korea is among the leading external partners in Southeast Asia that contributes to this. You don't hear a lot about it. It happens very quietly. But in terms of the regional conversations that happen on some of these non-traditional security challenges, South Korea is actually doing quite a lot. And it's actually the same with respect to security needs of Southeast Asian states. So if you look at since the 2000s, countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, these are countries that are increasingly looking to South Korea already to buy some of their defense equipment. So even if it hasn't been sort of actually advanced in terms of a big policy priority, there's a lot of action that is actually ongoing episodically in these individual relationships as well. And then the fourth is the obvious one, which is changes in the geopolitical environment, where you have I think a combination of a more assertive China, which South Korea and other Southeast Asian countries have had to grapple with, but also, frankly, a more unpredictable the United States, right? So you have the rebalance by the Obama administration, and then you have the Trump administration. And I still sense, despite what I sort of try to sort of convince my Southeast Asian counterparts that, hey, the Biden administration is trying to reinvest in some of these relationships. The question is, how long is this going to last? Is this the next election where we're going to have another US president who's going to be more domestic focused? So I do think we're still in a period of flux geopolitically. So some of the dynamics I want to, in the paper, what I mentioned is that this is not something, advancing security cooperation between the United States and South Korea and Southeast Asian countries is not only something that's viewed from the lens of opportunity. There are also challenges which are very well grasped by those in Seoul and in Southeast Asian capitals, as well as in Washington, right? So the Moon government's New Southern Policy is a great example of this. They actually have specific security priorities that they've been trying to drive over the past few years. And it is no surprise that they've had challenges driving this within an ASEAN context and with respect to individual Southeast Asian countries. So there have been ideas mooted like an annual ASEAN South Korea defense ministers meeting. That hasn't happened. There have been mooted measures on how to improve security cooperation between South Korea and Indonesia. That hasn't happened. That's not as much due to what happens in Seoul. That has to do with what happens in Southeast Asian capitals as well. So there are reasons why we haven't seen as much security cooperation, and that not only has to do with what Seoul is doing or what Washington is doing, it also has to do with the regional environment in Southeast Asia, where these countries are having to balance a lot of these individual relationships. So I'll spend maybe one more minute, because I realize I'm running out of time here, to talk about the implications that I discussed in the paper. I sort of mentioned 3 or 4 areas that will be really important to emphasize for South Korea in its cooperation with Southeast Asian states and also with external partners like the United States and other countries like Japan and Australia and so on and so forth. I think one is managing the differences in prioritization. So it's well known that you're not going to get Southeast Asian countries to care more about North Korea than you are South Korea. You're not going to get South Korea to care more about the South China Sea than you do individual claimants. But I do think there are obvious areas where both sides see common areas of cooperation. And actually, COVID-19 has actually brought that to the fore. A lot of the South Korean successes in terms of dealing with fake news, disinformation, data privacy, secure supply chains, these are a lot of conversations that individual Southeast Asian countries are grappling with. And that's an obvious area for cooperation that really transcends China and these geopolitical challenges that actually lead to some points of friction. The other one I would mention is, the real value I see that South Korea plays in terms of US partners and alliances is that South Korea really does try to integrate its cooperation in regional and sub-regional arrangements. That may not be as appreciated sustainably in Washington. Depending on the administration, the investment in multilateral institutions tends to be a little bit more uneven, but that is very much appreciated in Southeast Asia. And I think it is a good thing that we're seeing a lot of focus between the United States and South Korea in investing in regional, but also sub-regional arrangements, whether it's the Mekong and so on and so forth, right? So if ASEAN is preoccupied with the crisis in Myanmar, and next year you have a transition from Brunei to Cambodia in terms of the chairmanship, and ASEAN is busy in that sense, there are a whole lot of other sub-regional and global institutions where the United States, South Korea, and other Southeast Asian countries can work together on an episodic basis. And I'll sort of end here. I also do think that our focus on the quadrilateral or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue or Quad, I think that's an important mechanism and we should continue to advance it. I personally see the Quad as only one of a multitude of arrangements that we can use. And the whole purpose of multilateralism is to produce flexibility by which we can engage on these issues. So I think, form really should follow function. And depending on what issues we're working on, whether it's HADR, the Mekong, defense arrangements, defense industrial patterns, we should really let that dictate things rather than asking questions about how should South Korea be involved in the Quad, how should South Korea invest in ASEAN. I think those, to my mind, are secondary considerations. Really, the issue is what issues are we advancing and how are we promoting the interests of South Korea and Southeast Asian states. So I'll end there and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Prashant. I think that last point really echoes one of the key points from yesterday's conversation as well about South Korea joining the Quad. Whether they change the name or something along those lines, there needs to be, there are other opportunities for South Korea to get involved, particularly at the sub-regional and regional levels other than the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, as you mentioned. But thank you both, Andrew and Prashant, for those presentations. I think that gives us a really great start. I wanna ask everyone before I turn things over to Xuping, if you have any questions, please remember that you can use the Q&A function on Zoom in the bottom. Type them in and we'll be able to address your questions after the discussion that Xuping is going to get us started on right now. So I'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you so much, Carl, and thank you so much, KEI, for inviting me to be the discussant to two excellent papers by Andrew and also Prashant. So I would like to bring in yesterday's session's context into the current discussion. I particularly like the remarks by Admiral Scott Swift, so of which he mentioned about the Cold War mentality will not work very well in the Indo-Pacific era, and I very much agree with that. So US-China confrontation would not bring much benefits to international community, especially in the Indo-Pacific region as well. So recognizing that working together is very important. And this is where the other powers such as South Korea, Japan, and even ASEAN can come in and to provide the space to navigate the so-called troubled water as titled in yesterday and today's session. So I would like to start with where Prashant left last, the point about Quad. So Dr. Kim Ki-jong yesterday, actually, when being asked by Ambassador Stevens about Quad, so he admitted that it is still very much sensitive. And from my conversation with the South Korean Foreign Affairs Ministry officials, I think there is two main school of thoughts about this. Under the more conservative leaning, they would very much prefer to be part of Quad Plus, but of course the reservation by the much more liberal supporters would think that it is quite dangerous to associate with it because it sounds like an exclusive club. So against what has been discussed just now, that it should be flexible, a type of alignment. However, not only South Korea thinks so. And that includes the Southeast Asian countries that sees Indo-Pacific initially as a way of a containment strategy against China. So containment is of course against everyone's interest. So despite all those concepts and contexts that has been promoted and introduced by the United States and its like-minded partners, I think what South Korea is already doing is to take the actions rather than taking side, choosing side by expressing them rhetorically. So I think this pragmatic and functional based action and policy direction is what ASEAN are anticipating. So next, I would like to highlight the complexity of engaging ASEAN. So major great powers may conflate ASEAN as a group of Southeast Asian countries that are like-minded, but we are much more diverse than everyone else think. And with the Myanmar crisis, which is testing the integrity and also ASEAN centrality, actually, we are also looking a lot around and see who can be our long-term partner and commitment to this region that can help us to resolve this issue or provide some creative solution. So today is the anniversary of Gwangju uprising. So President Moon Jae-in's statement about support for Myanmar people's craving for democracy against the military rule really resonate very well. So we pretty much hope that after this, there will be more and more such sentiment being expressed, and that this is definitely a very good starting point when we want to bring in the values, universal values, especially such as human rights, peace pillar, where Andrew has emphasized that is the pillar policy area that we should, South Korea should invest more, and so as converging with United States security interests in as well. So the name Indo-Pacific ring a bell for people who are familiar with India. So the India factor is another angle that we should bring in into the discussion of US South Korea cooperation in Southeast Asia. So several Southeast Asian elites are very candid in expressing how they feel about working together with India. So I think by finding a kind of a common ground where this US Indo-Pacific framework can be applied in Southeast Asia is an opportunity for all sides to engage in. So aside from the intra-ASEAN dynamic that we have talked about just now, another area under the peace pillar is actually North Korea. So North Korea has diplomatic relations with all Southeast Asian countries, now minus Malaysia. So there are many interests in putting several track 2 channels for North Korea to continue to be engaged with the international community, not just Southeast Asia. For instance, just recently, Chosen Exchange, a Singapore-based NGO, has announced that they successfully conducted the second session of online lecture series with North Korean counterparts in Pyongyang. And I think this is something that is the first of its kind and something that has been overlooked by all partners, including maybe from South Korean government and also from the United States. So if Biden administration is sincere in reaching out and trying to reach a basic understanding of what they can do with North Korea, track 2 channel via ASEAN or Southeast Asian countries can be a way forward. So next, of course, people are very concerned about the security economic nexus in these sets of relations. So what we can tell from the papers written by Prashant, so he has a very useful table here mapping out the initiative and existing ASEAN-ROK security ties in the areas of transnational crime, humanitarian assistance, maritime security, cybersecurity, and the others. So what has been, so this is one of the question I would like to ask Prashant. So how do you see the prospect of defense cooperation going forward? Since 2010, South Korea has been able to increase arms sales around the world, and notably a lot of Southeast Asian countries are very much interested in signing up for those projects. So for Indonesia, it was, so they're halfway there, so we are not sure how the rest of the year or contract will be realized. Right now, there is also an agreement between South Korea and the Philippines in the maritime domain. So I would like to hear from you how that will pan out under the Peace Pillar Initiative. As for Andrew, I really like how you start your paper with the Asian regional architecture. So you frame it very well with the history of the institutional development in Southeast Asia from the Seattle Southeast Asia Treaty Organization that is supposed to mirror the effort on NATO in Europe. So of course it doesn't work well, and this is why ASEAN came about. So since a lot of Andrew's main argumentation is based on the US bilateral alliance mechanism. So I would like to ask your opinion about how the United States and South Korea can better converge each other's policy. So from US is the Indo-Pacific strategy, and from South Korea is the New Southern policy. So aside from the peace pillar that we have addressed just now, South Korea's place in Asia regional architecture might be more active than many people think. For instance, the middle power activism has been actively promoted, not only between South Korea and ASEAN, but also between South Korea and Australia. So perhaps from what I observed is that there is hesitancy in policy signaling. So yesterday, the panel mentioned about the China factor, and also to manage the not really the equidistance, but to navigate between the great powers such as United States and China. So the competing narrative that drives activism actually lies in not only in the US-based alliances, but also in ASEAN-based multilateral platform. So to connect to all of these platforms, I would like to call them as multi-track and multi-layer. Multi-layer, just like the diagram that you show us just now, there are so many lines, so many circles, and one country that's overlapped in many different mechanisms and frameworks. So it can also work out in the way of multi-tracks of diplomacy, security, and economy. So so in the way, while people would think that security initiative has been downplayed, the opposite actually is the truth, because there were several initiatives taking place. They are still in the stage of brewing, and maybe this is why they are not so obvious. So among the 4 country studies that I undertook with my project members, including Professor Cheng Chui Kwik, a frequent contributor to the ASEAN Forum. So we identified that maritime security, non-traditional security cooperation that Prashant has mentioned, including cyber, environmental security, natural disaster relief, but also defense partnership with Indonesia, the global maritime fulcrum, fighter aircraft, submarine, and with Singapore, aerospace, defense, maritime sector, peacekeeping, with Malaysia, the ADM plus military courses and seminar, and we used to have military officials exchange between the 2 countries, but that has been ceased for many years now. And with Thailand, there was actually a very vibrant defense industry going on after Thailand has witnessed the extent of cooperation between South Korea and Indonesia. So with that, I would like to end with a final question to Andrew. So also yesterday, Ambassador Stevens mentioned about South Korea being very comfortable in the outreach, such as New Southern policy, engagement with India, and many more. But they seem to be very reserved when it comes to Indo-Pacific, Quad, and so on. So how do you think South Korea find its comfort zone in those myriads of troubled water? With that, I end my remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuping. Those were very great comments. I think there's a lot of good questions in there for both Prashant and Andrew. Before we go to the audience questions, I'd like to give Prashant and Andrew a chance to respond to any of your thoughts or your direct questions. I think your first question was directed to Prashant. So Prashant, do you want to address anything that Chuping said directed at you?
Yeah, sounds good. So first of all, thanks Chuping for the comments. I think there were sort of three buckets of issues that you addressed that I think are really pertinent, and I found frankly quite challenging when I was writing the paper, and still actually grappling with these challenges. One is sort of the regional environment in Southeast Asia, which, as you noted, has gotten a little bit more complex. So on the one hand, you have a series of countries that are thinking more about their internal and external security, but in an environment like right now, where we've had in the span of 2 years the COVID-19 crisis and now Myanmar, there's going to be a tendency for more stress on regional institutions, and also more of dealing with what's going on in Southeast Asia, rather than sort of reinforcing the perception that in the 1990s and the 2000s there was a little bit too much focus on engaging external partners and enlarging ASEAN, and actually the institutional processes and the mechanisms that individual states use to address it are going to be difficult. So I definitely recognize that, and I think any sort of effort for South Korea and the United States to drive cooperation within Southeast Asia needs to recognize those realities. I think the second point you made that was quite sharp is the sort of defense cooperation element between South Korea and Southeast Asia. As you noted, South Korea actually has done a lot already on a functional level. The issue, really, to my mind, is there has been a hesitancy by Seoul to actually brand this more in terms of how, for example, just to take an example, Japan has actually taken all of what it's done in the security component and actually come up with a security-oriented vision for Southeast Asia called the Vientiane vision. If you look at what the Japanese have done, it's all of what they've been doing for the past 2 decades, right? There actually isn't a whole lot that's new, but it nonetheless, in an ASEAN context where there's a lot of focus on branding and institutions and meetings, it is really important to have that umbrella to actually bring all of these components together. But my sense is it's not that policymakers in Seoul are not aware of this. It's that they understand that this is going to give it a geopolitical weight and shift that they'd prefer to avoid and advance functionally. And I just think that creates a little bit of a disconnect perception-wise, because if you look at some of the polling, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies does their annual polling. South Korea, in terms of perceptions, it's seen as an economic and technological heavyweight. If you look at 5G, South Korea is far and away the best trusted country for that in terms of telecommunications. But if you look at security and these geopolitical conversations around U.S. China, it's one of the last countries that Southeast Asian elites, let alone Southeast Asian publics, actually think of as the country to engage, right? So I think that's kind of the disconnect we're sort of dealing with. And then the third bucket of comments that you addressed was on the broader regional environment and how the United States, South Korea, and Southeast Asia think about engaging mechanisms like the Quad. And I do agree with you fully there that, to my mind at least, the whole purpose of multilateral cooperation is to produce, like I said, flexibility so that it's not these unwieldy multilateral arrangements where you're asking who's doing what, and it's beyond the bilateral arrangements where you're caught in this alliance framework. But to my mind, when we have these conversations about who's joining the Quad, why are you not doing X, why are you not doing Y, that really gets away from why we're creating these multilateral mechanisms in the first place, which is provide flexibility. So to my mind, it's, I think Mike Green used to say this about aspects of security cooperation. The motto we should adopt is Nike, which is just do it. So just have meetings, whoever wants to attend, do it. If you want to focus on HADR, fine. If you want to focus on the maritime domain, fine. If you're uncomfortable with one aspect of security, move it to economics, move it to another dimension. And I think we should really be thinking past this conversation about who's joining the Quad, what is the Quad for. We all know, irrespective of what we think, it's not about China, it's more than China, but it's also about China. So the more conversations we have about this, the more we're getting past the issues we need to cooperate on, and the more we're fixating on disagreements that really don't need to be relitigated over and over again.
Andrew?
Yeah, sure. So Chuping had addressed 2 questions, and they're actually connected. One was about how U.S. and South Korea can emerge on the NSP in the Indo-Pacific. And then her final question was about the Indo-Pacific and the Quad and how South Korea can find its comfort zone. I actually think Prashant had a very nice answer about finding the comfort zone. And it's, when some people equate the Quad with the Indo-Pacific, and of course, Indo-Pacific is a region, and getting South Korea to join the Quad shouldn't be the goal. And of course, that's not in South Korea's comfort zone. But even something like the Quad Plus, I think that's something that that's a grouping that maybe South Korea has warmed up to and may be more comfortable in engaging other Indo-Pacific countries. I think another thing that South Korea do is they could actually use the language of the Indo-Pacific. If you look at South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs statements, they don't. I think they've started using it more frequently, but at the beginning, they just avoided that term, and I think it's because China sees it as Indo-Pacific concept that's directed at them. But as Prashant mentioned, it's actually more than China. It goes beyond China. So I think adopting that language may help other countries. It may send a signal that, oh, well, South Korea is also engaged with thinking about these regional issues. So that might be one way through just language and discourse of becoming more acclimated to the Indo-Pacific. In terms of convergence, there has been specific efforts at coordination between South Korea and the US. It's usually at the directors level. So there's a strategic economic dialogue that's been held for the past it's held annually, but this is where meetings have taken place where they try to discuss specific programs or specific projects where there are linkages between the NSP and the Indo-Pacific. And there's a fact, you can find it on the web, there's a fact sheet that the US Embassy had put out. But beyond that, I mean, one thing that I would point out is that it's interesting that when it comes to NSP and finding linkages to the Indo-Pacific, South Korea has really just done it bilaterally. Like they've been working with the US or they've been working with Australia. But I think one thing that should shift is I think South Korea could try to discuss it could try to link the NSP and the Indo-Pacific at a more multilateral level. So I actually think there has been connections between the US and South Korea bilaterally. I think there could be more, but one area that has to develop further, as I mentioned, is the peace pillar. I think until that component is in place, I think there's certain limitations to what you can actually converge between NSP and Indo-Pacific. So I'll stop there. I can see that there's a bunch of questions in the chat box for the Q&A.
Yeah, there are, and I think the conversation that we're having right now about how things are framed, the conversation around these topics are just as important, if not more important than some of the tangible cooperation outcomes or the different cooperative initiatives and how we talk about them. Just as matters just as much, if not more, than what actually gets done through them. And that leads into the first question. I have a few questions of my own, but I think I'll try and squeeze them in towards the end if there's time. But our first question comes in from Robert Gay, who's really looking at different IR theories and how they apply to South Korea's position in the region, whether it's a balance of power between the United States and China, and South Korea more or less being stuck in between there, or there are aspects of liberalism with emphasis on institutions, which both Prashant and Andrew brought up. Or like I said, just now we're talking about the conversation around these issues. What about constructivism? What sort of ideas, how do ideas come into play in forming the norms and creating the institutions in the region that help sort of to shape South Korea's position? So more or less talking about the three different major schools of international relations theory and how they apply to South Korea's position right now. So if anyone has any thoughts about all three or one of the three, feel free to take that one.
I feel like being an international relations professor, I better take a swing at this question. I actually love this question just because it tries to think about different international relations theories and apply them to the South Korean context. And of course, I don't think it's just any one of these three schools of thoughts that matter. You can see any combination of them. But the argument that I put forth, because I'm focused on regional architecture, it is very much seen as an institutional argument. It's through institutions that I think South Korea can leverage, I guess, its middle power status. And to take one IR theorist, John Eikenberry, his argument is an institutionalist one, but it's never just about institutions. There has to be power. It's the combination of power and institutions. And so, in some sense, South Korea, they have to fend for themselves. They have to either form alliances or band together with other countries, but they have to be smart about it as well too. And so I do think that it's a combination of this realistic institutional approach. And of course, the norms, they come in because one thing that the US and other countries want to see they do want to see, assuming that you subscribe to the liberal internationalism, that they do want to see norms about an open order, about rules and laws and institutions being enforced. And so, of course, norms occur when these are internalized by the actors. That hasn't happened yet. So one thing that that policymakers are trying to do through institutions is to get states to develop or adhere to certain norms that can help regulate actions and behavior among states. So I think power and institutions, but we hope that those things can help develop norms for the region so that we don't see different countries beating each other up down the road.
Okay, I think that was a great answer, Andrew. And I think you you definitely proved that you are an IR professor. And next up, we have a question from Mark Mannion, the Congressional Research Service, who question is directed towards Prashant. He says, you hinted at South Korea's increased arms sales to Southeast Asian countries over the past decade or so. How heavily has the South Korean government been involved in promoting these sales, especially in the form of financial assistance and grants?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think Chuping kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. So the distinction that needs to be made between South Korean companies and contracts with individual Southeast Asian countries, and to what extent those arrangements are actually built into a regional strategy around security cooperation that's advanced by the South Korean government. And I would say that the issue is what I sort of mentioned in my opening remarks, which is you're seeing a lot of activity, but in terms of the branding as a sort of concerted effort geopolitically, you're not seeing as much of that in terms of direct sort of engagement. And the example I give in the paper is, South Korea has been, the Shangri-La dialogue, which I mentioned earlier, that's held by Singapore. South Korea started its own Seoul defense dialogue. If you look at the way in which these security institutions are utilized by different countries, there are countries, Singapore is one of them, that utilizes this as a way to actually a platform to promote young leader cooperation. It's actually a way to actually get at all-round cooperation using security as a starting point. Whereas the Seoul Defense Dialogue, if you attend those meetings, it's actually a very different feel. You get a sense that this is an effort to focus primarily, it's also very much more government focused rather than sort of elite and sort of people to people in nature. And part of that is because it's a newer institution. But I do think, one of the suggestions I make in the paper is that there are a lot of things that South Korea doesn't really have to do much in terms of new initiatives, but there's a lot of rebranding and expanding on what it's already done that it can do much more significantly. That actually would have a significant effect. But then again, as I point out, there are reasons why those things are not being done, right? So to my mind, one of the first things you do when you ask why policies are not adopted is why are they not adopted, right? And to my mind, it has to, going back to what Andrew said, you can start with these arguments about geopolitics, about power, really, in international relations, going back to sort of my PhD days, you have to ask broader questions about state capacity, about threat perceptions, about norms and their limits to really get at why things are not happening. And that's, to my mind, the big question about not just South Korea, but the United States, right? If you talk about the rebalance or the pivot, why did it underachieve? It wasn't because it wasn't a great idea. It wasn't because the United States didn't have great power, right? It was because a lot of the state capacity constraints advanced post the global financial crisis weren't as realized, right? And the threat perceptions with respect to China relative to the other considerations under the Obama administration were not as unified, right? The consensus around whether China was a threat or an overt challenge to US relative to the Trump administration wasn't as built out. So power is a great starting point to start the conversation. I frankly don't think it's a good point to end. I think there's a lot of other things that happen that condition how states ultimately act and behave.
Great. I think that's a great question and a great answer. Next up, we have a question from Gil Rosman, who asks, if China is the driver and not the US in the Indo-Pacific, what Chinese actions in Southeast Asia would shift Seoul's response to the Quad?
Sure, I can try to answer. I mean, I guess I have a different understanding with that premise because I don't think China is the only driver. There's also questions about other Quad members. I've heard that part of, the United States would like South Korea to be more engaged with the Quad, but what about Japan? Or I've heard arguments that with India, they think 4 is enough, and would it get messy? So there's that question from this other members of the Quad, and how welcoming would they be of South Korea? But in China's case, and what actions would take place in Southeast Asia, I'm not really sure. I almost want to think that China would have to really get South Korea angry, like do something maybe on the North Korea front, or slap on, or do another economic boycott. And in retaliation, maybe South Korea might suddenly come running towards the Quad. But in terms of the region within Southeast Asia, it's because the only thing I can think of is maybe when it comes to development cooperation or investments that South Korea has, if China comes in and tries to poach everything or undermine South Korean contracts in the region, that might get South Koreans thinking about engaging more with maybe Japan and the United States, with Australia, maybe joining the Blue Dot Network and doing things that look more like an Indo-Pacific country rather than doing its own thing with the NSP. That might nudge the United States, or excuse me, that might nudge South Korea in the direction of the Quad. Those are some of my thoughts.
Just to build on that, I totally agree with what Andrew was saying, and I would have a sort of more interconnected way of thinking about these things. So what China does is definitely a component of that, but to my mind, we've already seen that experiment, right? So we saw that with the THAAD deployment and South Korea's reaction. So if you're waiting for China to do something that prompts South Korea to actually react in a way, the question you should be asking is why that didn't happen. And that has to do, to my mind at least, much less with what China did, but more about how Seoul thought about its broader regional environment. So what was the United States doing? What were the other mechanisms around the region, the sub-region globally that South Korea actually was engaged in, not the Quad, right? So I guess that's how I would sort of position it. It's less about, if we're hoping that China is going to serve as this big sort of challenge around which all of us are going to coalesce around, I think we're going to be waiting a long time. I think China has a very proven pattern of making sure that it can advance its interests while also cooperating with other countries and dividing it up. The vision, I think, goes back to what Ashley Tellis mentioned at yesterday's panel, which is that if we're really serious about promoting a multipolar Asia, right, and that's what the whole Indo-Pacific is about, it really isn't about what each individual country is doing with other countries. It's more about boosting what as many countries can do in the region to make sure we have a more multipolar Asia rather than a more sort of China-centric region.
Yeah, I think the THAAD issue is definitely really important, and we kind of tend to think about it as either a bilateral issue or an issue between bilateral issue between the US and Korea or Korea and China, but it definitely has major impacts on South Korea's regional approach. And I think that was sort of a major double standard in the way that the Trump administration approached the free and open Indo-Pacific, whereas it was offering up all these aid and assistance to countries in Southeast Asia, at least ostensibly, to help with coercion with China. But the largest case of coercion with China in the region wasn't there, was over the THAAD incident, which was directly related to something that the US was doing, and the US didn't really do all that much, if anything, to sort of help shore up its South Korea's interest in dealing with China on that front. So I think it's really important to bring in as much information as we can to help sort of as many data points to help understand why South Korea hasn't necessarily shown a lot of interest in joining the Quad, and what sort of, even if we move forward, what sort of actions China would, even if China were to pursue a more aggressive policy, why South Korea might still be hesitant to join the Quad. So I think that's a really great point to bring in there. We have another question here coming in that asks, the US-China strategic competition has always affected the choices of US allies and partners, obviously including South Korea. And I think this question really gets to the core of what we've really been dancing around here for a while. What's the best way for South Korea going forward? Is it neutrality, hedging, linking with the United States, or decoupling with its patron ally, the United States, and choosing China over the US? So what's sort of the best path moving forward for South Korea? Andrew, you're still unmuted.
Sure, so I am. And I saw a comment that the sound is still faint. I tried to switch the system. Is that any different right now, or I'm almost shouting, so that may be it too. But I saw the earlier question too about decoupling, and I'm glad, Kyle, you followed up on what exactly is meant by decoupling. But in terms of the best strategy for, of course, South Korea ideally would like to maintain its partnership with its alliance with the United States, but also have amicable relations with China, its largest economic investor, trade partner. And the fate of the Korean Peninsula, it runs right up against the border of China. It has to have good relations with China, but it's becoming increasingly difficult as US-Sino tensions have heated up. So in an ideal world, the hedging strategy can work for a lot of the time as long as US-Sino relations are okay. But what we're finding is that finding that hedge or finding that middle ground is becoming more and more difficult, and I would say almost unsustainable, because and it's not really about choosing sides, but as I was saying, South Korea has an opportunity to shape its strategic environment. And some South Koreans may disagree. They might say, oh, we're not that big of a power. Maybe we're only a middle power, so we're limited. I mean, I think South Korean officials vacillate back and forth here as well too. But there's a point where if other countries who are engaged in the Indo-Pacific are taking action or making responses to in response to some of China's more assertive bullying actions, but South Korea remains out of the picture, you're gonna become marginalized. I don't think South Korea is doing itself any favors by staying outside of these conversations. So it's not about tightening the alliance with the United States. I think the alliance relationship is quite robust right now, but it's engaging with other countries in a more multilateral front. So and in that sense, I think South Korea is moving in the direction. It is warming up to things like the Quad Plus, but I think that's the direction that South Korea needs to move in moving forward, engaging other countries in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to dealing with concerns about China.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think within this context of U.S.-China dynamics, which I think we got at this a little bit earlier, the context for U.S.-China relations is not constant, right? the environment which we were dealing with U.S.-China relations in, just the last 10 or 15 years, the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the Biden administration, that has changed. The conception of the Quad, that's changing as well, right? And the Indo-Pacific as well. So the constant, to my mind, seems to be for all countries, including the countries in Southeast Asia and also South Korea, is maximizing choice domestically, finding out ways to do that, and then promoting a more multipolar conception of Asia abroad while maximizing their competitive advantages, right? Each power has certain aspects that it does better at relative to other powers. And in a context of greater competition, you want to make sure you're maximizing what you're good at. Not everybody can be good at everything. So as long as South Korea is following that, in a context of, let's not forget, extreme, not only changes in the regional and global environment, but domestically, right? So we have this disconnect now where you have a new Biden administration, but the Moon government is also winding down, right? So you have this reset on the clock because South Korea is a democracy. But to my mind, that sort of North Star still probably is something to keep in mind in terms of the big picture.
Those are both great ways to think about South Korea's position moving forward. I know it's a bit challenging, but we'll see how things actually progress moving forward. And I think the first major upcoming milestone, Prashant, you mentioned this in your remarks. We haven't gotten to it yet, so I get to ask one of my questions as the last one, which is this upcoming Friday. We have the Biden-Moon summit. And so I'd like to ask each of you, what would you like to see Friday in some sort of agreement between Biden and Moon as it relates to the two countries' respective Indo-Pacific policies? How likely do you think that's to come to fruition? And what would you be happy with coming out of an agreement of this summit between Moon and Biden?
I would say, just to start, more sort of progress on the things that the region has been worried about in the past few years, particularly under the Trump administration. So more investment in multilateral institutions, economics, and COVID-related assistance in terms of pandemic response and secure supply chains, and less of the focus on the things we already know, which is that we are not going to get as much agreement on geopolitical issues like China and North Korea, just because we already know that there are differences between the two sides. So I guess the less we focus on that and to what extent of convergence we have between US and South Korea versus Japan, and comparing notes on what standards we're talking about, and the more we're focused on those aspects, I think that would be a successful outcome.
Certainly, what Prashant mentioned, things that haven't really been addressed but are immediate issues of the immediate, such as response to the COVID-19 pandemic with vaccinations. I think if they can have some kind of understanding and some form of cooperation on that front, I know South Korea is going to ask about vaccine productions, and I think that would be a win. I do want to push back a little bit, though. I do want to see a little more engagement on the issues that they have been discussing for years, geopolitical issues regarding China and North Korea. The Biden administration completed its North Korea review last month or early this month, and there are questions about how much how forward should the U.S. be when it comes to engaging North Korea. And I know the Moon government is hoping that there can be a summit soon, and I don't know what the answer is right now, but certainly I hope that there's I hope that they can work together on this front to try to restart engagement, not necessarily having a Biden-Kim summit right off the bat, but certainly having the U.S. move towards that direction. And then on the geopolitical front, I don't expect South Korea to join the Quad, but like I said, I think in Korea there's even domestic pressure, I think, to have the Moon government do more on the Indo-Pacific front. And hearing President Moon acknowledge that and the need to do more on the Indo-Pacific, I think that would be certainly welcome.
And Chu Ping will give you the last word.
I agree with Prashant and Andrew about COVID-19, and there is an urgency to settle some of the perceptions gap in regards to China. And I agree with Andrew that President Moon would most likely wanted to secure a last word on North Korea. So we know that the Biden administration prioritized human rights issues, and that is very much a concern in the Moon government, as Professor Moon Chun-in has recently just expressed this concern about Biden's North Korea policy would not be what Moon Jae-in is hoping for. That said, I think there is three major chessboards. So I'm borrowing this term from my colleague, Professor Cheng Chui Kwik. So he termed the geostrategic and the geoeconomics as the two major chessboard between the US and China. And I think there is a third player or the balancer, what South Korea would like to call themselves. The third chessboard is definitely about multilateral engagement, and also if they can't always include North Korea agenda, that would be a win. And since the last joint statement between US and South Korea on Indo-Pacific and New Southern policy, and that was between the official level, so it has not been expressed by the summit level yet. So we will see whether Biden and Moon will make that commitment in the coming summit. Thank you.
Well, we'll see what actually happens on Friday. Hopefully some of the things that we discussed today will be included in there. We'll certainly all be paying close attention to that. I know I probably speak for everyone listening. This has been an extremely enlightening conversation. I think not only did you do a fantastic job of covering the things which we, your respective papers, and Chuping raising some great points and some questions, but really some wide-ranging engagement with different topics, and I really appreciated the connections that everyone attempted to make between the conversation that we had yesterday and the conversation we had here today. And I know we could have conversations tomorrow and the day after. This is a never-ending discussion that we can have here, and I look forward to reading all of your future work on this really important topic. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining us. Encourage everyone to please check out the papers that both Andrew and Prashant have written on our website, and wish everyone have a good day, good evening, wherever you find yourself in the world. Thank you.